We're now going to look at critical path, a technique used to determine what items or tasks are critical on your project. And we're going to show you the best way to actually demonstrate or represent a project schedule. The critical path method was developed by DuPont in 1950. Its intention is to determine the amount of flexibility or float you have within task and within your whole project. It determines the minimum duration of a project. It's also used to prioritize activities, so you know what tasks are critical, and then if you need to, you can put more resources towards that particular task to bring it back on schedule. Now, let us look a little bit more closely at how we go about determining what a critical path is. So what you're going to see here is you're going to see this little diagram here that has a description. That's the name of the actual task. And within that, we have 6 squares. And the squares represent particular values. In order for us to do a critical path, we really need to do what's called a forward pass and a backwards pass. And I'll explain that as we go through. But let's have a look at some of the things. DUR stands for duration. It's really at this particular point in time. This duration comes from our work breakdown structure, and it's actually the only thing we actually know at this point in time. ES means the earliest this task can actually start. EF stands for the earliest this task can finish. Then we have LF, which is the latest this task can finish. And then we have LS, which is the latest this task can start. And then ultimately we have float. Now float is the project management term for flexibility. The amount of time or the flex time that you have in this task before it absolutely has to be completed. Now what I'm going to do now is walk you through how we actually do a critical path. The first process that we go through is what's called a forward pass. And a forward pass starts at the left and goes to the right. And basically what it does, it wants to compute the earliest a task can be finished. So what we do, you take the earliest a task can start plus the duration and give us the earliest it can finish. I'm going to walk through it now. Look at task 1.1. I'm just going to put 0. I know mathematically that's not correct, but 0 and 5 will give you 5, and that makes for easy math as we go through. So on task 1.1, the earliest we can finish is 5. Whether it's 5 days, 5 minutes, 5 years, doesn't matter. As long as your durations that you have, your time frames are consistent, it'll work. Now let's go look at the next one, 1.2, at the very top there. Since 1.2 relies on 1.1 to be completed before it can start, then the earliest it can start is 5. We take 5 plus 2, and what gives the earliest it can finish is 7. Let's look at another task. Let's take 1.3. Again, 1.3 relies on 1.1 to be completed, so the earliest 1.3 can start is 5. 5 plus 3 gives us 8. Now you're sort of getting the hang of this, so I won't repeat too many things, just so you can get the hang of it. You can see where the numbers are coming from. Let's look at task 1.5. 5 plus 3 is 8. Let's continue on. 1.4 now gives us 8. 1.6 now gives us 16. 1.7 now gives us 11. Earliest it can finish. 1.8 gives us 16 and 6. The earliest it can finish is 22. Now for the very last task, 1.9, since all the other tasks to the left of it have to be completed, then the earliest it can start is when all the other tasks are actually completed. So in this case, it can't start until 22. So 22 and 5 is 27. So now this is actually telling us that the quickest we could actually do whatever this group of tasks are is 27. Again, 27 minutes, 27 hours, 27 months, whatever duration that you use, whatever symbol or degree of time that you use for that, that's what it's really telling us. So that completes our forward pass. We'll go on and do a backward pass. Now we're going to do what's called the backward pass. We're going to start at task 1.9 and we're going to end up at task 1.1. And how we calculate that is we want to compute the latest a particular task can start, and we do that by taking the latest it can finish minus duration. Let's have a look at it. Starting with 1.9. 1.9, the latest it can finish is the same as the earliest it can finish is 27. So 27 minus 5 is going to give us 22. Take another task, which is 1.8. It's 22 minus 6. Now I'll just run through these particular tasks going backwards, and you can see where we get the numbers from and how it's calculated. Pretty straightforward, pretty easy to do, simple math. I'm on 1.2 right now. Then ultimately we get to the end of it, going backwards to task 1.1. And we take 5 away from 5 equals 0. So there we have our backward pass. Now we're going to do one more thing to determine what our float is. So now we're ready to do the last step in calculating the critical path. We've done our backward pass, our forward pass, and now we're ready to do and determine what the float is, or the flexibility is for each one of the tasks. We simply do that by taking the latest task can finish minus the earliest a task can finish, and that will give us our float. So let's start. Task 1.1. 5 minus 5 is 0. Task 1.2. 18 minus 7 is 11. Pass to task 1.3. 8 minus 8 is 0. I'll go through the rest. You can see how we're doing. Task 1.7. 22 minus 11 is 11. Task 1.8. 22 minus 22 is 0. To the last task, 1.9. 27 minus 27 is 0. So now we've gone through and we've determined all the float or the flexibility each one of the tasks. What we really need to do is look at what the critical path is. Now I've done this quite obviously in the red. Is a critical path on any schedule is all the tasks that have the least amount of time for the flexibility or for the float. Now, the question is, can you have multiple critical paths in a project? The answer is absolutely you can. But that's the way you determine. So those are the critical elements. Now, the whole idea of coming up with a critical path is to say, as you go through and you start to do the work, you can see where you can allocate resources if you're getting a little bit behind or you have limited resources. So, for example, in this diagram, when we look at task 1.2, 1.5, and 1.3, once 1.1 is completed, we have options now. If we only have limited resources that can do all the three next tasks there, 1.2 and 1.5 and 1.3, we most likely would put that limited resources on 1.3 because it is crucial or more critical than the other ones. It has less flex time. Again, it has 0 flex time. That means it has to be done right away, whereas the other ones will have 14 and 11. That gives us more time to do that. So you can see how, by determining your critical path, you can allocate resources to make sure your critical items are done, or critical tasks are done, before some of the other ones that have more flex time. As a project manager, it gives you a lot of flexibility or a lot of leeway where you can allocate limited resources, or you can readjust your project to make sure that you are successful. I want to take this moment to provide some key items to consider when doing your critical path. Number one key item to consider doing your critical path is that there is software, project management software out there that actually can do critical paths for you. You enter the task and it can do the critical path for you. Sometimes it does it very well, and sometimes it doesn't do it very well at all. It depending on how you enter the task and your knowledge level of that particular software. So that's item number one, is there is software out there that can help you do critical path. Item number two is there can be multiple critical paths within a schedule, and there can be upwards of 10 or 12 or even more than that. Usually when there's that high of a number, you might want to break your schedule down into smaller components to help you facilitate that. The third item I want to mention is that in order for you to understand critical path, it is a suggestion and best practices that you learn how to do critical path manually. You go through an exercise to determine critical path, and then if you want to use software, take that same task and the same critical path, put it in the software, and see if you come up with the same critical path. If not, there's one or two things you may want to do. Not use software, or learn a little bit more about how that software actually works so that your manual critical path is equal to your computer-generated critical path. The last thing I want to mention about critical paths is that they are very powerful tools, and it is best practice for one to actually do a critical path. If you don't do a critical path, it's almost impossible for the project manager to make adjustments on the fly to get that project back on schedule, because you don't know where the items are critical. You're just going by your gut, whereas the critical path will tell you the actual tasks that need to be addressed in order to get you back on schedule. The last thing we want to do as part of this module is basically create a project schedule. The most common way to create a project schedule is by a Gantt chart, which we'll talk about in one moment. This image here is a Gantt chart. This Gantt chart was produced by Microsoft Project, which is a computer project management software program that's used around the world. It has some interesting things on it. It tells you the task, it tells you the duration of things, and it has some key elements on it, as highlighted there. It's up to you as the project manager to explain what these elements are to your stakeholders, but it is a very good way to demonstrate to them what tasks you have and what your schedule is and where you are in that particular schedule. Very well accepted and very well used throughout the wonderful world of project management. Another item that's often used to represent a schedule is called a milestone diagram. A milestone diagram is basically your key indicators of where you make progress as you roll out your schedule, roll out your project. It's a high-level tracking of progress. Interesting enough, the milestone diagram comes from the Romans. The Romans, when they were conquering the world, would go out and for each mile they would actually put down a stone, and that would give them some indication of how long it would take for them to move troops around to go wherever there was any trouble areas. But the milestone diagram is basically a high-level thing. We won't go into much here. It's sometimes used, but sometimes it's very complicated, a little hard to explain, and lots of project managers don't like to use this when they communicate with their stakeholders because of its complexity.